unified command last night. We all agree that it was very coordinated. We were structured to be able to deploy all of our resources in a deliberate manner. We spoke to how bad the weather was so that we can identify the remains within 5.5 hours. And I would like to give a special thanks to my airport deputy manager, Francisco Tejada, and the entire airport operations team and the professionals standing behind me. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much, April. The Westchester County Airport, as a matter of public policy, is a quite debated issue, and perhaps rightfully so in terms of every matter of public policy, that there are debates about what should happen with a particular asset. What cannot be debated is the quality of the people that work there every day and that provide the basic services as they are laid out by those of us who have some decision-making role. April, please convey to your team how much we all appreciate the professionalism and the time and energy and effort that you showed last night. Next, I'd like to ask Richard Wishney, who is our Commissioner of Emergency Services, to join us here. The county has an interesting reality in which we have certain assets, both in terms of physical material and equipment and also professionals, and we have to work and mesh with local emergency services. So in this case, the Armonk community and other nearby communities, managing that process effectively is not an easy job. My friend of many years who served as a town supervisor, an elected official, and a professional in the private sector has been doing a terrific job for us as Commissioner of Emergency Services. Richard Wishney.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. Last night was something that we trained for throughout the year. We have an amazing group of fire and EMS personnel, police personnel. All of them received an alert around 5:25, 5:30 yesterday, and the alert was called a level 1 alert. That meant that there was a light aircraft involved in an incident. At that time, we have a program all written down, practice again monthly. We have a large drill every year involving all of the various agencies. This is something that the county takes very seriously. And the number of assets last night was quite amazing. When the alert went out, we had 4 primary departments responding. They deserve nothing but credit for the amount of folks that came immediately. The Armonk Fire Department, the Portchester Fire Department, the Purchase Fire Department, the West Harrison Fire Department. Those were the primary departments that responded. EMS resources were there. The first 3 primary EMS agencies that responded were the Armonk Fire Department EMS, the Harrison EMS, and the Portchester Rybrook EMS. I can't tell you how proud I am of being involved in that program last night. The event was frightening to us because at first we didn't know where the plane was, and as April indicated, the search was both on land and water. And one of the unbelievable events last night was the weather. The weather was impossible. We could not use the drones that we normally would put up in the air. They were ineffective in the rain. County Captain Police Jim Greer, when he arrived at the scene, he suggested that we ping the cell phones. And April and her staff were able to get the cell phone numbers of both the pilot and the passenger that were on the plane. We were able to then ping. That gave us a general idea of where the plane was. Still not sure of whether or not it was in the water or on the land. Later in the evening, a couple of hours into the event, the DEP was on the scene. It was their property. They provided boats. They provided personnel. They provided security and control. As you know, as soon as word goes out that there's been an event like this, everybody comes. Everybody wants to help. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work well. So I want to personally thank the chief from DEP that's with us today. You'll hear from him. And his staff. They did a great job, security-wise, search-wise, and using all the assets that they had available. The FBI came into the scene and brought in some specialized equipment to ping the phone of those individuals that had been on the plane, and that immediately gave us a possible location. The coordinates were given, and the rescuers that were already on the land proceeded immediately to that location, led by the DEP team. They found and the wreckage. The unfortunate victims were on the ground, and it was confirmed that they were dead. There was some wreckage in the trees, and the scene was secured with the assistance of Joan McDonald. The medical examiner was notified, immediately responded with his team, and as the county executive mentioned, because of the religious affiliation of these folks and the need to recover the bodies and have them buried by sundown today, we all felt the compassion and concern to help remove those bodies as quickly as possible, have the medical examiner do what he has to do, and I'm pleased to report that the bodies have been released and are now being flown to their home in Cleveland, where they'll be buried in the appropriate fashion as their religion desires. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to tell you about. Just again, I want to tell you how impressive the coordinated effort was. April Gaspari and her team were amazing. Again, we practice, but practice is not the same as the event. The pressure, the concern we all had, we didn't know where the plane was, all of that, the weather on top of it, quite a scene. But wonderful people behind me. I should mention two of my staff that were helping us last night. Dennis Del Borgo, he's a director of our Office of Emergency Management, and Chief Neil Computo is the coordinator of our fire services throughout the county. We had hundreds of firefighters there last night, and police and EMS folks. So with that, I'll turn it back to the county executive.
Thank you. Richard Wishney, our Commissioner of Emergency Services, and let me repeat what he said, to thank Dennis, to thank Neil, to thank Susan, and all the other members of your team for what you did last night, and also to Terrence Rayner and the members of DPS. You mentioned Captain Jim Greer and his team for their work on site, and how appreciative we are of all of that. Next, I'd like to ask Chief Frank Milazzo of the DEP, who is Chief of Department, and of course the New York State Department of Environmental Protection has responsibility for the land as well as the substance of the water system that we draw, as well as New York City drinking water, not just here in Westchester County, but over a multiple county area. This is an important job that Chief Milazzo has, and the other members of his team who are here, and he will talk a little bit about investigation and also about the going forward of where we are. Chief.
Thank you, Kenny. So at this point, the FAA has arrived this morning, and we're now waiting for the NTSB, which will be out later this afternoon. I would just ask that everybody realize that that area is going to be sealed off and secured for the next several days. As everybody's talked about, the area in question is heavily forested, so it's not going to be an easy ordeal to remove the wreckage once the investigation is completed. And obviously, we're always concerned about any impacts anything could have, so we're going to be working closely with our partners within the agency and the Bureau of Water Supply to make sure that during the removal there's no contaminations that happen to any of the property. I know everybody else has spoken about it, but last night the weather was just horrific. At one point, the thunder and lightning that was going on while those emergency responders were out in the field, it was treacherous, and they all did an admirable job. And the other group that I know a lot of times we all seem to forget about it, but the people in all our communication center, ours, the counties, and the real-time crime center, getting information out, because communications is everything. But the men and women that were doing that were exceptional in getting the information out to everybody. It was very helpful. So at this point, the area is going to be stayed closed off until the recovery has been completed, and we would just ask that everybody, abide by the lines that are set up. There is a space for the media outside, but that area, the park area, there will be closed for a period of time. So, thank you. Thank you, Chief.
I'm going to open it up for questions in just a second. Just a couple of closing thoughts on the narrative. Yesterday at 5 o'clock, I was in Pleasantville. Pleasantville Chamber of Commerce had a reopening of a restaurant. Margaret Kunzio was there. She and I had a chance to chat. And I remember just about 5 o'clock, I had to leave just before the food started. And I had to get in my car and drive down to a couple of events I was going to in Yonkers. And as we said good evening that night, we'll see each other tomorrow, I got into my car in due time. Everybody moved on to whatever they had to do next. And I drove from Pleasantville down to Yonkers through the very same pouring rain that you described. Sawmills under construction, so there's lots of different things that you have to be mindful of. And I'd like each of you to think about what you were doing last night at 5 o'clock. My friends in the media, Lisa LaRocca, Sean Adams, Tony Aiello, Gary Stern, what were you doing last night at 5 o'clock? Where were you? And you might have been in a home setting, an office setting, you might have been in your car as well. If you were driving as I was at that point in time, you realize what a treacherous night it was. Now imagining that you're Baruch Taub, who's an airplane pilot, so no skill I don't have, and that you're now flying through that same weather that I drove through, and you realize, knowing what you know about piloting an airplane, that your airplane is in deep trouble, is going to lose altitude, that you need to put this thing down safely as fast as you can, and you are trying to keep in control of the vehicle as best as you can, and communicate with the FAA as best as you can to try to bring this airplane in an airport that most likely you're not familiar with, on a night that was miserable. The human element of this is what I think about. It's what I thought about when I went to bed last night. It's what I thought about when I woke up this morning. The human response of men and women who stayed at their post and went over and above the normal efforts. As Chief Malazzo said, as Richard and April said, people who went out during thunder and lightning last night, walking through pitch black, dark woods to try to find trace of this airplane, to try to find, at the very least, for proper, respectful treatment, 2 people whose lives were lost. It's a serious moment. And I would say, when all else is left to us, let us pray. Let us pray for Mr. Taub. Let us pray for Mr. Chaffetz and their families. You will write the stories and run the news stories that you have to run. We will go back and look at this, fine-tune efforts. We will praise the people that deserve the praise. But at the end of the day, 2 lives are lost, and we owe them a debt of respect because they lost their lives. And had things been different when I left that restaurant, driving on the Sawmill River Parkway, anything could have happened to me or could have happened to you at 5 o'clock last night. It happened to them, but it could have been us. Let's open it up to any questions. If you want to direct it to anybody, we're happy to do that. Tony.
If I could ask Ms. Gaspari, the air traffic control audio indicated they were heading for runway 16. Is that the longer runway that's parallel to the state line?
It is, Tony. It's the longer runway, and it would be landing to the southbound because the predominant winds were out of the east, specific direction 100 degrees. So they were trying to land runway 16 north to south on the long runway.
When you look at this, you really can see how close they were to reaching their destination.
Travesty, yeah.
It's inconsequential, ultimately, the inconvenience that this caused. There were reports last night of a Tier 2 ground stop. Do you have any idea how many planes were delayed, how many passengers might have been delayed? Again, just as a data point, because the important thing is that these 2 men lost their lives.
I do not have specific on any of residual delays to aircraft. I know that specifically at Westchester County Airport, when it was reported that there was a missing aircraft, we did momentarily close the surfaces for aircraft to move because we did not know where that aircraft were. We wanted to make sure that it was safe for all other movements.
And finally, the air traffic control audio, when we hear the tower, is that the JFK tower?
There are a series of towers, and where the FAA controllers hand off that communication, when it's local to each airport within the 5-mile range, then it is each local airport's air traffic control tower. If it's beyond that, it's what's called the regional radar control tower that we call TRACON.
Other questions? Lisa?
You were talking about, and we all know how horrible the weather was last night, and I know this is a long investigation, it's early, but, and we know that it was engine trouble that started this, but would you say preliminarily that weather definitely played a role in making it difficult for them to reach the airport? Is
Is there a professional who wants to answer that? Layman, I would say yes, but I'd defer to a professional. Okay.
The other thing is you mentioned, and how poignant, that that the passenger had a few moments to speak to his wife at the very end, and obviously kind of keeping things personal and out of respect, but do you happen to know, was this happening as the plane was flying, when it was down? Do you know
My
any of
understanding,
that?
again, Congressman Lawler was essential in having that information for us, and it's very poignant. And I don't know that I want to give the exact words, but he was saying goodbye. He was saying goodbye.
And just one final question, any kind of time frame of when the wreckage might be moved out? I know you said this is going to be a couple of
Chief.
days, it's going to be closed off for a few days. I know it'll be a
Chief,
little while.
Chief, come on the microphone if you would. Thank you.
Historically speaking, because unfortunately we see more of these than we care to, I would say 2 or 3 days at least. A lot of that's going to depend if the NTSB, when they get in, they're flying in from Florida, what time they get in today, if they actually get onto the scene today. We don't have a lot of daylight to work with, so they may not even start till tomorrow. And then they have to bring in a salvage recovery crew to work with our staff to work on that. So I would think at least through the weekend, if not into Monday.
Chief, can you describe the condition of that aircraft? Is it largely intact? Is it, how high, is it suspended in the trees? Is it on the ground?
The aircraft is severely damaged, but there are large pieces intact, and most of it is on the ground. There is a little bit suspended in the air.
And Chief, just while you're there, can you clarify, is Rye Lake formerly part of the reservoir system?
Paul, do you want to specifically talk? I'll let...
It's my understanding that water flows freely between the lake
Yeah.
and the Kensico
This is
Dam
Paul
reservoir.
Rush. He's the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Water Supply.
So thank you for the question. Number one, at a time like this, it's important, as the county executive says, focus on the families and the loss. So Rye Lake is part of New York City Water Supply System's Kensico Reservoir. The entire system there has roughly 30 billion gallons of water, so it is part of the reservoir system.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was wondering if anyone could say something about this aircraft in particular and why it might have been low on oil pressure so early in the flight?
I'm not sure, Gary, that any of us have that knowledge about the particular equipment, but what we will do, and I'll ask Catherine Chaffee to do this, is take notes of any questions that we can't answer and who asked the questions. So if we can give you some follow-up information, we will. Any other questions from any of our friends? Yes.
I believe it was April Gaspari who was saying before exactly how far off the plane was from the runway. I think you said 2 miles. Perhaps if you could just expand on that a bit.
1.5, 2 miles. So we started our search at the north end of Rye Lake, which was about 3.5 miles. North of the airport was our radius of our search and rescue, focusing on that life safety, narrowing down toward where radar blips and cell phone.
So he was trying to land. I'm just trying to figure out. And okay, and so he came too far. Would you say too far off? the runway or?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll have to let the investigate.
I'm not going to ask the professionals to comment because it is a matter of the investigation, but from a layman's standpoint, because I did allude to this, he was losing altitude.
Right.
I mean, that's what happens when the plane is deficient in whatever fashion. And so my sense is that had he had a little more altitude and a little more time, he'd have made it safely to the runway. What the investigation will determine is what happened inside the plane that caused the plane to lose its ability to remain airborne for that last mile and a half, 2 miles, which is an excruciating, we're talking minutes, if that much, that it would have been more that he needed in order to clear the lake and land on the runway. But the investigation will give that the details. Obviously, that's a layman's response.
Yeah, no, I understood. It helps. It helps for reporting. Thank you.
Sure. Marcus?
It was mentioned that the FBI pinging helped give a precise location. Once that was identified, given the conditions, how long was it until then the plane was actually located?
The search was already underway, and the members of the search teams were already on their way towards that area. It was just a few minutes before the wreckage was sighted and the confirmation was made of the 2 fatalities.
Any other questions before we... Yes, Lisa, go ahead.
Just one other thing, I mean, it's sort of extraordinary when you think about, again, the weather, the hundreds of people, you're talking about it's 10 minutes just to get inside. This is a difficult scene, and yet you all took the time to, because these are 2 men from an Orthodox community, to make sure that they are able to be back on a plane right now and buried before sundown in Cleveland, Ohio. Talk a little bit about the efforts and what went into that, with everything else that was going on.
Well, I think that, we've heard on the professional side that the finding the airplane was essential. Obviously, at some point, professionals look at what they hope is a rescue operation, and then at some point, it turns into a recovery operation because of the circumstances. The fact that it did not go in the water made rescue a bit more of a hope, but it became apparent when the wreckage was found that this was a recovery operation. I think no matter what the religious tradition or ethnicity of the passengers were, we would have done that which was appropriate for that individual. In this particular case, because we are aware that there are specific rules, as I mentioned, this is what Joan McDonnell, and we've been through this in other settings, not necessarily in a crash setting, but we reached out immediately to representatives of those communities. Again, Congressman Lawler was helpful in this regard, as were others, and we understood that we had to, in order to be appropriate, that we had to take certain actions, and we would have done that for anybody, regardless of what those traditions were. In this particular case, we did that, and again, that's where our medical examiner's office was appropriately staffed overnight in order to be able to handle this middle of the night, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, I gather, Lisa. So the intent was, as it was in every part of this operation, through every one of these organizations, to do that which we know we needed to do. And to the extent that we did everything we could, we certainly tried. So I'm sure that you may want to interview some of these individuals when we break this up. Individuals may or may not be able to do that if they'd like to, but I welcome you to have that conversation with anybody else that you'd like to have. We thank you for being here today. If we have substantial information to update you on, we will do that. I don't know that we might have a press conference. I think really what Chief Malazzo said is really coming from a different level of government when the inspection is completed, and most likely it'll be at that level that you get the next update as to what happened, because that's when you get specific information that can be released, and then your questions will most likely be directed that way. But if there's something we need to do to communicate with you, let us know through Catherine. We'll be happy to do that. Let me thank again all the professionals that are here. We sit in permanent debt to each of you, each and every one of you, and the people you represent. And thank you, working members of the press, for being here today on short notice. Thank you and have a good day.
Oh, okay.
Send it out to